Good morning. This is Jim McDonald from the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And today I'm going to talk about how we use data from the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, that is, the ARMS data. Our major uses include, first, custom reports, what we call staff analyses, that are provided to policymakers at their request, policymakers in USDA and in Congress. Those are unpublished, that is, we provide them directly to those policymakers and don't release them to the public. However, the vast bulk of what we do is made available to everybody. This breaks out into our extensive financial reporting on the farm sector and also a series of reports that we produce each year on policy-relevant issues affecting the farm sector. These are made available at the ERS website in print and in briefings like this. Let me start by talking about our financial reporting. The chart here refers to our big headline chart that we do in our forecast briefings for farm income. This is from our most recent one, produced at the end of November of 2018. And at that point, we were forecasting net farm and net cash income for the year 2018. We do this 3 times a year, February and August and in November. We provide forecasts for income for the coming year, and we provide estimates of what did happen in the past. As you can see in this chart, net income for the farm sector rose sharply after 2009 and peaked in 2013. Since 2013, it declined considerably and is now below its long-run average. And in 2018, we were forecasting that it would decline a bit from the modest recovery that occurred in 2017. Now, this is what we call our headline chart. It's the first thing in our briefing. It's what shows up in newspaper reporting. But we also provide comprehensive information and analyses on the financial performance of the farm sector. We provide these national estimates, but also estimates by regions and for states and for different types of farms, as well as for components of net income, that is, expenses and revenues. These estimates rely heavily on data from the ARMS survey. Now, as I noted, our forecast goes into details, in this example, for revenues and for expenses. The chart on the left-hand side tracks the change from 2017 to 2018 in cash receipts, the major item on the gross income side. It shows that increased production led to an increase in revenue by about 7%, but that increase in production was offset by declining prices. On average, a decline in prices received of about 5% in 2018, so that on net, we were forecasting that cash receipts would increase by 2.5% in 2018 over 2017. However, expenses rose by more than that amount, leading to a decrease in net income for the farm sector. On the right-hand chart, we break out major expense categories and sort them according both to their size and whether they're increased in 2018 or, in the case of the 2 bottom ones, seed purchases and fertilizer, showed modest decreases in 2018. Now, what we just talked about was income. We also talk about the sector's debt and assets, or the balance sheet, as opposed to the income statement for the sector. In this, we show long-run trends in the ratio of debt to assets and the ratio of debt to equity for the farm sector. Remember, equity is the difference between assets and debt. What we see here is rising debt ratios since the peak of net farm income in 2013. Farmers have been taking on more debt, and land values have not been increasing as much as they had in the past, such that asset values, which are made up primarily of land, have not been increasing as much as they did in the past. As a result, debt-to-asset and debt-to-equity ratios have been rising for the last few years. However, it's important to compare this to the farm financial crisis in the 1980s. That's where that sharp peak occurs in the figure. So far, our debt risks do not nearly approach what was there in the 1980s. The situation facing agriculture today is far less serious than that in the 1980s. I'll add that ARMS provides comprehensive information that allows us to make those comparisons. ARMS also allows us to provide detailed analyses of where risks may be most pronounced. That is, it's important to look at different components of the farm sector in order to identify where risks might occur. For example, ARMS also allows us to take a look at debt exposure across farms in different commodity categories, as we show here. In this chart, we break out farms into several different crop and livestock commodity categories. We show the ratio of debt to assets for all farms in that category. That's the blue bar. The red bar is the percent of farms in each category that have relatively high amounts of debt relative to assets. These are farms with debt that exceeds 30% of assets. As you can see, there are substantial differences across commodity categories. Field crop operations carry relatively low debt relative to their assets, and they have relatively small shares of farms that have high levels of debt, as compared to hog, poultry, and dairy producers who carry significantly more debt relative to their assets. One can go into this type of data further to identify those areas where there may be particularly strong emerging risks. This is not something that we could easily do before we developed the ARMS through the 1990s. Who uses this type of information? Well, it's important for policymakers, but they're not the only people that use it. This type of data is used widely by input providers, firms that produce and sell farm equipment, chemicals, seed, and feed to farmers. Equipment in particular is highly sensitive to changes in net cash income in the farm sector. Farmers buy more equipment when net income is up, and they buy considerably less equipment when net income is down. For producers in this sector, it's important to try to think about where net income is going in order first to plan production for the coming year, and secondly for retailers to plan inventory levels for the coming year. The data provided by ARMS makes that sector work much more smoothly and effectively in service to farmers. Secondly, lenders and investors care. They care about what the likely risks are of lending, and they care about thinking about what sorts of guidelines they should use. What I should emphasize here is that credit tends to freeze up when lenders are concerned about the future and when they have very limited information about the future. Good information, good and accurate information, is far better to have than no information, even in a world where things are pessimistic, where farm finances have fallen compared to previous years. That's the world we're in today. Nonetheless, accurate information allows credit to continue to flow to farmers. Finally, this information is widely used by extension agents and by farm advisors. It's through those people that this type of information analysis and advice flows eventually down to farmers for their own decision making. As I said, ARMS data is also used in policy making, of course. Congress, USDA decision makers, and others used ARMS-based data. The representatives of farmers, commodity groups in Washington, used the ARMS-based data in developing their own policy positions during the Farm Bill and during other types of issues as they come up during the year. The data informs Farm Bill discussions and implementation, as well as other agriculture-related policy. Now, I spoke about sector farm income, and I spoke about the sector balance sheet, assets and debt. We also use ARMS to report on farm household income. We define that as income flowing to the farm household from the farm, net of expenses, plus off-farm income. Household income provides a direct measure of how farmers are doing, not just farm businesses. Information on household income is necessary to assess how tax proposals work. They really work through household income and not directly, usually, through the farm. It's needed to assess the full impact of farm policies, and it's also important in thinking about how changes in the farm economy, from crop prices to drought to export booms, actually affect farmers and their families. Now, in the table that we show here, what we've done is sort farms into several different categories reflecting farm sales, and for small farms also reflecting the occupation of the farm operator. Many farm operators are retired. Many also have an occupation that's a primary occupation that's off the farm. They primarily work off the farm. So we've sorted farms into these several categories, and what we do in the table is show how many farms fall into each category. Second, we show median, as average household income for farms in each category, first from all sources, and second, household income that comes from farming. The difference between the two, of course, is off-farm income. Now, one thing to notice to begin with is to look at the top two rows. Farmers that are retired from farming and farms where the operator's primary occupation is non-farm together account for more than half of all U.S. farms. This is apparent in most USDA statistics, but it's often not obvious to people trying to interpret and use those statistics. Those farms produce very little farm production. In consequence, all of their income essentially comes from off-farm sources, and their income from farming, as you can see in this table, actually comes out on average to be a small negative number. Their expenses exceed their revenues from farming. As you go down the columns, you can see that income from farming rises substantially and is actually quite important for mid-size and large-scale farms. You can also see, however, in each category that the difference between income from all sources and from farming is substantial. Most farm households in most of these categories have significant amounts of off-farm income. Finally, notice if we sum up to the bottom row and look at all family farms account for 98% of all U.S. farms. Not shown in the table, they also account for 88% of all farm production. This is not widely known among people outside of agriculture. It's an important point, along with a number of other issues, to convey to people outside of agriculture to help them better understand how the farm sector is structured and how it operates. That information, again, comes out of ARMS. Now, let me talk about a few types of analyses that we do related to the recent Farm Bill. Farm Bill was just passed in 2018. Over the next year, USDA will implement the Farm Bill, setting specific rules for how different programs are to be administered. ARMS-based data are used both to inform the bill and its implementation. And household income estimates, as it turns out, are used, and I'll show them in several examples now. Here's my beginning example. This concerns payment limits and program eligibility. Payment limits refers to rules that limit the total amount of payments that a farmer may get from commodity or conservation programs. Limits on program eligibility restrict the eligibility for commodity or conservation programs to households with incomes that are at or below some threshold level. Now, the chart that I'm showing you is from discussions that occurred after the implementation of the 2008 Farm Bill. The example I have is a particularly clear one, and that's why I'm using it. However, I can tell you that these issues, questions concerning payment limits and program eligibility, come up every year. They come up in every Farm Bill, and they come up each year as we evaluate and provide information for policymakers on proposals to adjust farm policy. Now, in 2008, a household with $750,000 or more in income from farming would be ineligible for commodity and conservation payments. That limit was raised to $900,000 in the 2014 Farm Bill and remains at $900,000 in the 2018 Farm Bill. Now, notice that that threshold refers to household income from farming. Other proposals, and at times other limits, are based upon total household income from farming and off-farm income, and some have been based on off-farm income alone. Because we have information from ARMS on household income and its sources, and because we have information from ARMS on the payments received by farmers, as well as other attributes of the farm, we can assess these types of programs. The chart displays the share of farm households who are receiving direct payments in this case, and sorts them by their household income from farming. The red bars show the percent of payments that were flowing to households in each category. As you can see in this chart, we estimated in that year that less than 2% of farm households that were receiving commodity program payments had household income from farming that would have exceeded the threshold. And those households received in total about 3% of total commodity payments. We can use this type of analysis for all kinds of different proposals for payment limits and for eligibility rules in order to analyze the likely impact of those rules on participation and the budget impact, the amount of money flowing to different types of households. We use ARMS routinely for these types of analyses. Okay, why is there interest in this sort of thing? As I said, we're asked to analyze this type of issue every year. Well, really there's interest because over the long haul, the structure of agriculture has been changing, and as a result, payments from commodity and conservation programs, as well as from crop insurance programs, have been shifting to higher income households. The driving force there is that production is shifting to larger farms. Commodity program payments and crop insurance indemnities in particular follow production. So as a result, they're shifting to larger farms. The people who operate larger farms tend to have higher household incomes than the people that operate smaller farms. And as a result, payments are shifting to higher income households. That itself is not surprising and not all that controversial, but it's important to get a good quantitative grasp of it. And in this chart, we use ARMS data going back to the 1990s to display those trends. The red line shows the household income, average household income of families receiving commodity payments. And what you can see is that red line is increasing steadily over time and increases quite a bit over a 20 to 30 year period. And I should add that these measures of income are adjusted for inflation over time. So we're looking at, in a sense, real purchasing power. Similarly, the flow of crop insurance indemnities follows a similar path, shifting to higher income households. One way of using that notion of higher is to compare it to other U.S. households. The black dashed line shows median household income, again adjusted for inflation, for all U.S. households, while the black solid line shows median household income for all households with a self-employed head. Think of that typically as other people who own small businesses. And you can see up until the 2000s, commodity payments flowing to farm households tracked pretty well against median household income of other people that own small businesses. But since then, it's risen sharply compared to that. Again, this is not surprising. It's not even that controversial. However, it is an important factor, and it's an important factor in driving changes in farm policy. In the past, both in its design and in the rhetoric to analyze it, farm policy placed considerable emphasis on income support. That's no longer what farm policy really does anymore. The primary design on policy and of the rhetoric we use when we assess it or analyze it is focused more on risk management. And that, I think, really follows from the trend shown in this chart. That brings to an important current issue, and one that arose in analyses of the 2018 Farm Bill. Farm policy, as I said, has shifted towards an emphasis on risk management. It's now a primary rationale for commodity and crop insurance programs. An important question here is, well, is farming actually a risky business? I show quotes here from two different organizations that are critics of current programs. The Heritage Foundation, in their proposal for farm policy, argued that agricultural risk is not a significant issue for most farmers. While the American Enterprise Institute, also a critic, said the evidence indicates that farming is in fact a much less risky financial enterprise than most other types of business. Farm household incomes are relatively stable. Now, we're able to use ARMS data to assess these propositions. The way we've done it is to look at household income for farming over time. And we do it in two different ways. In this chart, we track median household income for all commercial farms. So this is an average across all farms. You can see it goes up and down a bit over time since 2000. However, it generally trends upward, and the fluctuations from year to year are not particularly large. That's the trend in the average household income for commercial farms. Commercial farms we define as people with at least $350,000 in sales. That underlies the American Enterprise Institute assertion made on the previous chart that it doesn't look all that risky. However, that's an average across all farm households. If we think of a typical farm household, in any given year, you might have an income above that average, and the following year, your income might fall substantially to below that average, even as other households whose income was below that average rose. So in other words, the blue line doesn't really track the experience faced by individual farm households. Now, because larger farms show up in ARMS in multiple years over time, we're able to track what happens to their income over time. And what we've done in the red line is track the income of a typical commercial farm household that has the same average income over time, represented as the blue line, but it captures the year-to-year fluctuations in income faced by those households. You can see that income can fluctuate widely. There are 2 years, in fact, in which it is a large negative number. There are other years in which it's well above that blue line, much higher than the average. In short, what we're able to do using ARMS data is to show not only the trend over time in average incomes, but to show that household incomes for commercial farms actually fluctuate substantially from year to year, and those farms face significant financial risks, particularly in comparison to other industries. So ARMS plays an important role in framing how the farm sector actually works and informing policy decisions and designs. Now, let me talk about a related type of research topic. One more example. USDA financial support for farmers, as I've indicated, has shifted to crop insurance. Now, most farmers pay premiums for crop insurance. What many are not aware of is that their premiums are considerably cheaper than they would be otherwise because USDA provides payments directly to insurance companies. Farmer premiums are probably less than half for most farmers what they would be if they had to pay the full premium themselves. That's what we mean when we refer to USDA financial support for crop insurance and what people mean when they refer to subsidies for crop insurance. Now that we're providing far more support through crop insurance, there are important questions about that. One is, does crop insurance actually affect farmer crop decisions? Does it distort what we would do normally in markets? Do those decisions affect environmental quality? One particular way of looking at that, or a way of framing it, is to ask, does crop insurance lead to more planted corn acreage and less acreage of other crops than we would otherwise see? And because corn acreage uses typically more fertilizer and more herbicides than other crops, if crop insurance causes increased planted acreage of corn, does that create more environmental risks? We can use ARMS to analyze these tricky and controversial questions. Our own research, using ARMS and other data for 6 Midwestern states, found that subsidized crop insurance had only small effects on crop choice. We estimated that corn acreage was up by 1.7% as a result of crop insurance support, and the total crop land planted was up by well under 1/10 of 1%. In turn, that increase in corn acreage led to a 0.33% increase in soil erosion and nitrogen loss. So we identify that crop insurance did have some impact on choice and on environmental impacts, but those impacts continue to be quite small. And the quantitative issues are what's particularly important here. Now, an important point to make here is that USDA, Congress, farm groups, and actually Heritage and AEI all use ARMS to make their arguments. That's important. It keeps the policy debate honest and keeps it focused on important issues rather than having discussants arguing over made-up facts. And I can say without ARMS, there would be far more made-up facts in foreign policy discussions. That's a credit to the NASS field office staff, to enumerators, and to respondents who have made ARMS the valuable tool that it is through our work over 20 years. ARMS tells an accurate story of U.S. agriculture. It provides the facts that are needed to make for more effective policy. It also provides the facts to give the public a better understanding of American agriculture. All right, these types of analyses and others show up in a variety of ERS reports that are produced during the year. I show here covers from 8 recent reports, some of which cover broad analyses of the farm sector with information on how farming is organized. For example, you can see the familiar America's Diverse Family Farms report there. And we have others that look at particular tax policy and agricultural policy issues. You can judge from the titles. Now, what's new in 2018? Well, we're going to bring out soybean and cow-calf specific versions of Phase 3. What we get from the specific commodity versions are baseline information for our estimates of annual commodity costs and returns. We're also able to track key production and conservation practices for those commodities, and we're able to track the adoption of innovations in each of them. In this chart, what we've done is use our cost and returns data. As I said, ARMS provides the baseline cost and returns information. For soybeans, that's going to be in 2012. Our previous baseline was set, our previous baseline, I should say, was set in 2012. We're going to update this year to 2018. In between, our annual estimates are based only on yield and price data from other ERS sources. So our baseline estimates from ARMS give us much more comprehensive data with which to track costs and returns. What we show in the top chart is for soybeans as a whole, average total costs in dollars per acre in the red line, and the blue line shows average gross returns in dollars per acre. What you can see is that gross returns substantially exceeded total costs from 2006 right up till 2015. Farmers were making a lot of money in soybeans over that period. Those returns fell and turned negative in 2015, recovered in 2016 and 2017 such that on average soybean production was still quite profitable for farmers. As we know, 2018 is likely to turn out to be not a particularly good year for farmers, primarily because of declining import demand. It's important in 2018 for us to get a good grasp of what came out in that survey. Now, let's compare that top panel to wheat. Average net returns in wheat, which over time, going back to 2000, as you can see, are persistently negative. There were two strong spike years of profits, but otherwise gross returns were well below total cost per acre. We can see the market impacts of those developments as planted acreage for wheat fell substantially since the year 2000, while planted acreage for soybeans rose considerably. On net, acreage was flowing into soybeans. These are important indicators for market decisions and for farmer decisions as they evaluate where they're going to be doing their planting. Now, this data shows us average returns across all farmers, but as we've indicated earlier, there is substantial variation in the data across farms. Let me give you an example of that. Here's cost and returns data. This is for milk production. We produce this for all types of commodities, and what we've done in this chart is to sort farms according to their costs of production, from lowest to highest. And this is really quite striking, and I should say it's not unique to dairy. This shows up for most of our cost and returns analyses for commodities. That is, what it shows is a very wide range of costs. If you take a dairy farm, for example, at the 10th percentile, that is 10% of farms have lower costs and 90% have higher costs, our estimated total costs for that farm in 2015 was $17 per hundredweight. If I compare it to a high-cost farm, someone at the 90th percentile, 10% of farms were higher cost, 90% were lower cost, that farm had an estimated cost of $40 per hundredweight. That is more than a 100% variation between $17 and $40. That knowledge is important for thinking about the drivers of average prices, for thinking about farm policy, but also for thinking about the factors that drive differences in costs and efficiency. In dairy, we know that farm size and scale economies matter. Many of those low-cost farms are very large farms, while many of the high-cost farms are quite small. Scale is not as important in other areas, but other factors matter as well. Particularly in crops, weather matters. High-cost farms will often tend to be in areas that have been hit by drought. Location matters, reflecting soil characteristics and reflecting the climate, the long-term weather, and its impact on crop yields. Finally, innovations matter, the adoption of different types of technology. This data is important for analyzing the impacts of technology adoption on costs and on net returns, and is widely used by both farmers, farm groups, farm advisors, and commodity groups for assessing the likely directions of their particular commodity markets in the future. All right, let me summarize here. An important point we always try to make is that policy decisions are going to be made with or without arms. And I might add, as an aside, business decisions also will get made with or without arms. The people making those decisions, in this example, policymakers, some of them have farm backgrounds. Most actually don't. Most know very little about farming. Even those that have farm backgrounds, they're doing something else now. They're doing policy. They're doing business decisions. They can't just rely on their farm background and experience, which often occurred many years ago in a particular part of the country. Furthermore, they're all busy, so they rely on others for information. ARMS provides accurate data on U.S. agriculture. For farmers, I would say that ARMS is your chance to tell the story of American agriculture, both for policymakers and for that broader public. And I'd add that better information, which is what we get from ARMS, makes for better decisions, whether it's for policy or for business people trying to sell to agriculture. That concludes my presentation. We have here a few links to the ERS website, the NASS website, to ERS charts of note, and to the ERS farm sector forecast. Thank you.